Let's take a deep breath together. You know, I'm not really sure I can preach, if that's okay with you all. So maybe just let's have a conversation about grief. There was an article yesterday in the Washington Post that says, "Grief is love, not a mental disorder." It was written by Devin Greenberg. He's a student at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And apparently the American Psychiatric Association recently updated what they call its Bible, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Many of us are familiar with that. And for the first time, this highly consequential guide organized or categorized grief as a disorder when it is prolonged beyond 1 year. And I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, so I'm just saying what the article said about it. But I was struck by this young man, Devin, who lost his father to COVID in April of 2020. And he talks about his own journey of grief. And he's been doing work, going to grief groups, being on a grief journey, seeking grief counseling. And he said the purpose of this work, this internal work that he's been doing, has been to internalize the message that what I'm feeling is okay. He says if grief is the corollary to love, if grief is love, why set expectations on its pace or texture? Why pathologize love? And I must have said 100 times at different memorials over the years, it's okay to grieve. To grieve just means you love someone. Devin goes on to say in this article yesterday, it's not just personal indignation that stirs me about the association's decision. I worry for others who have loved and lost. I worry about this framing that will render us even lonelier in our pain. Even more convinced that our nonlinear, unpredictable paths through loss are wrong. And he says this beautiful thing. Grief is an experience with no roadmap. Ask anyone who has lost an immediate family member about grief's 5 stages, and you're likely to get a shake of the head. No, he says, grief is more akin to bushwhacking through a gnarly forest. Each of us needs validation that we can cry out from the thorns in our sides and that we aren't crazy for enjoying a sudden clearing, that whatever route we're taking, granting we're not harming ourselves or others, is the right one. Now, obviously, the associations, whatever they did with it, was about prolonged grief. But what Devin is saying is there is no roadmap. There is no pace. Grief is not linear. He says now, yes, there should be options and treatment for people who need it, absolutely. But what he says is it's time we accept that we don't move on, but move forward. It's time we stop pathologizing grief. Are you with me so far? You know, we're not very good at, as a society, of processing grief. We're not very comfortable talking about it much of the time. And the reasons for grief are manifold, and multiple losses just kind of tumble into our lives when we least expect them, like this morning. That's one thing of beauty about a spiritual community. We get to pause We get to have rituals and moments together, like this even, to name our grief. Communally, we're not so great at it because, let's face it, we've failed in our society to recognize our interdependence as well. So when you grieve, I grieve. But I think it's our spiritual responsibility to name grief and allow the space and the ritual and the moments to take their course. Because grief is an encounter with our humanity. It is not a condition to get over. The Buddhists say everybody has 10,000 joys and 10,000 sorrows. You know, people always apologize to me when they feel sad or have their emotions. We've all done it, haven't we? We start to cry and we say, I'm sorry. You may have noticed over the last number of years that I don't say I'm sorry when I cry. I just blow my nose and continue. And when people say that, I always say, don't say sorry. Don't apologize for your emotions. Actually, Ann Lee taught me that. Don't apologize for your emotions. It's part of our humanity. But facing grief is hard work. I know a lot about grief, not because I've had an overabundance of suffering or sorrow in my own life. I probably have an average amount. But I know a lot about grief because I have walked with so many people through grief. That's why. So there's not a face of grief that you could show me that I don't think I have seen. I used to lead at my last church grief groups, grief retreats, grief rituals. But for a few moments, I'd like to talk about grief in a way that helps us to continue to think about it a little bit. And it's from a book that I have read this week called The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Francis Weller. He lives in the Russian River. He's a psychotherapist and healer. And I really like his work, and I'm not going to spend much time on it, but I just want to lift up a few things because I think it helps us to have conversations about grief. And I know that even as I say this, looking around at you who I know so well, and I know the different grief points in your life right now. And they come from many different things. Weller talks about the 5 gates of grief, and it's just ways that we enter grief, basically. And he says the first one is, everything we love, we will lose. Not exactly a newsflash. Not exactly Jerry. But it's part of loving, is losing. And we choose it again and again. I mean, many of you know how much I love dogs. I've been with a dog since I was 2 years old. And the dogs I've had only lived 10 years. The average. And I can barely stand it when I lose one, but do I get another one? Uh-huh. And do I know what's going to happen? Uh-huh. So we all lose people that we love, but we lose other things, friends. Sometimes we lose our capacity to be who we were because of illness or because of aging. Anybody experienced aging and not being able to do the things you used to do? That's a loss. The losses of all kinds of things. We lost a lot in the pandemic. And I don't know that we've named that very well. Sometimes we grieve over what we have loved and we've lost, and it's a strange way to say this, but I think many white people across the nation grieve because what they once thought was reality in history, as they were awakened to the racial realities of our country, are grieving a loss of what they thought was true. But there's very little like the grief of losing a loved one. Let me read you this poem, brief poem. It's anonymous. It's from a long time ago, I think, but "'Tis a fearful thing to love what death can touch. To love, to hope, to dream, and oh, to lose. A thing for fools, this love, but a holy thing. To love what death can touch. For your life has lived in me, your laugh once lifted me, your word was a gift to me, and to remember this brings painful joy. 'Tis a human thing, love, a holy thing, to love what death can touch." So that gate many of us have entered. Weller talks about another gate of grief, the grief that we have over the places that we have not known love in our lives. The places that have lived within us, that are outside of our own circle of warmth, of compassion, of kindness. Those places of shame, where we perceive in some way ourselves, a piece of ourselves, as defective. And shame closes the door to self-compassion every time. And sometimes we grieve over those pieces of ourselves. And Weller said this beautiful thing. I don't know about you, but I've cried over those places and flaws in my own life. Grieve them sometimes. And Weller says this, that when you can grieve for those places in your own self, what that does, that grieving, those tears, it actually makes you realize that you are worthy. So if you have grieved for places in your own self, those places of whatever it is for you, shame. You know, I had a tremendous amount of shame around being gay, growing up in the environment I grew up in. And I've been completely, it might be a surprise to you, completely liberated from that. But let me tell you the amount of grieving that I did when I looked back on my life, the first 25 years of my life, and what was lost because some part of me knew I had to hide. When I could grieve that, then I could also then realize that I was worthy. And it doesn't matter if your story is anything like mine, you have your own story, your own details. And it's okay to grieve for yourself. Do you hear me? It's okay, and we need to sometimes. I can't take much more of this, so I'm just going to wrap up. Gate 3 talks about is the sorrows of the world. And I guess I just want to say it this way, kind of conversationally to you. The sorrows of the world are real. There's nothing more raw than seeing someone in grief. Nothing. We've seen that on the news a lot. But the sorrows of the world, whether it's an oil spill or the bleaching of the coral reef, the earth itself grieves, and we feel that if we allow ourselves to. The state of our society. For those of you that don't know, the shooting that happened in Sacramento this morning, 6 people killed, 10 wounded. The gun violence. I mean, the sorrows of the world. So and during the pandemic, I know, Jorge, you and I have talked about this, that there were days that we just didn't feel like we could bear the sorrow of the world anymore. It wasn't about us. It's just like if you let it in, it knocks you flat. And it's okay to grieve those things. So if there are days where you just think, I don't know why I feel so down, just check in with yourself. Maybe I'm just grieving the sorrows of the world. I can't remember what the last 2 gates were. We've gone through enough gates, haven't we? Okay, yeah, I need to stop now. Okay, so, but here's the thing. The poem from Rumi that Verl read for us, the closed fist or the open hand. So I guess if I want to say things about grief today, is take this away. Grief is utterly and fundamentally human. It's part of our life experience. But I would say to people during those grief times, yes, grief is a companion, but don't make it your only companion. Don't marry it. There's grief and there's gratitude. Like last week, there's heartbreak and there's hope. The prophet Isaiah speaking the words of God through him. Comfort, comfort, my people. Speak tenderly. Even the youths grow weary, but your strength will be renewed. Maybe not today, but your strength will be renewed. Some days you'll soar like the eagles. Other days you'll be able to jog a little or run a little. And some days, you'll barely be able to walk or get out of bed. And that will be your best. And you know what? That's okay. To grieve means you have loved. And better to have loved and lost than never have loved at all. So, as we grieve together over different losses that come into our lives, remember, you're not alone. When you can, always couple your grief with gratitude. And remember that you have community and loved ones to support you along the way, and there is no timeline for your grief. It's simply another side of love. Amen.